The Hoopers are out of town, as I understand it. So that's what. Canes, yeah, I don't know. Might have been a little tired tonight. That can happen. But what we're going to look at tonight is nothing too crazy. Just one of the most important verses in the Bible. No big deal. Not even hard. Not even a big deal. So we're going to open up to John 1:14. John 1:14, and I'm going to grab one of those ones there. We're going to be flipping around a bit, just because we're only going to do one verse tonight. But I say that because it's such an enormous verse, and it has so much. It pulls from so many other places and affects so many other places. We're going to be skipping around a little bit too to look at some other spots where it has value and meaning. But if we open up to John 1, let's get our bearings just a little bit before we dive in. We left off with verses 12 and 13. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And of course, we talked about last week that this is a fascinating couple of verses because they show that being a child of God is not something that just happens. Being a child of God, as Kathy, you made an excellent point last week, that everyone says, well, everyone's a child of God. Well, not according to John. That's not John's interpretation of events at all. John says that being a child of God is a specific calling for specific people. And specifically, who are those people? The people who were born not of flesh, not of blood, or the will of man, but of God. Which makes sense. Children of God would be born of God. That makes perfect sense. Which drives us into this next verse. We're no longer talking about the children of God, but the Son of God. Right? That makes sense in how the progression goes on. So let's take a look at this verse. We'll read it out. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So if we look at the Greek on this one, it's a good one because Kay's not here, which stinks because Kai is all over this place, and she knows that that's Anne. In any event, so Kai is how it begins. And the Word, the Logos, so the Greek term for the Word, became agenento. Remember, that's that becoming verb. Flesh, sarx, where we get like sarcophagus comes from that. So becomes flesh, and esenosin and hamen. So and dwelt. We'll talk more about this word dwelt. What does that word actually mean? But to give you sort of whet your appetite, the word means sort of like to pitch your tent. So to pitch his tent. We were reading Numbers tonight. We're reading about tent pitching and everything. We'll get to why he would use this word. And dwelt among us. And we witnessed the glory, doxa. So you've ever heard of doxology, right? Doxa is, and this is doxon, this is the form of that, but doxa is the word that doxology comes from. His, auto is his glory. And what kind of glory was it? It was glory from the monogenos, the one born, the only begotten, right? We'll talk about that as we go along too. From the patros, from the Father, and of course, as we go here, we're going to talk about what caritas, grace, and truth, aletheos, is as well. What is all that about? So it's such an important verse in terms of what the rest of John's argument. We really have to spend some time with it. So we have to begin with the word. If you remember, the only other time you get this ha logos, the word, is in verse 1. So verse 1 and verse 14 serve as kind of a bookends on a lot of stuff in between. This is also the last time you're going to get this word, the logos. Remember, on the first class, we talked about why would John use this term, the word. And we talked about that it had significance both for a Greek audience who thought within sort of Platonic, Plato's ideas that the word, the logos, was sort of this divine intelligence, almost as the idea. But in terms of the Jewish tradition, it has sort of a different idea, right? The Word of God, what God speaks to speak creation into being, right? So he's kind of playing with this idea by using this term, the Logos. But what happens here is he just sort of breaks the term down. So before I said it had this is a term that would have made sense both to Greeks and Jews, and now he takes those categories and just smashes them and says we're now getting into something new and bold. Because what does he say? He says the Logos becomes flesh. He could have said Logos becomes anthropos, becomes man. Could have said that. That'd be one thing. But he doesn't say that. He says it becomes flesh, sarx. Like as I say, we'll talk about why he would use that. So whatever we thought the word was up to this point, whether we were an educated Greek or an educated Jew, up to this point, whatever we thought the word was, throw that out. That's what he said. It's bold. It's wild. Remember, if we think of the word as being, in John's idea, when we think of if there's like a sentence we could use to describe how John thinks of the word, it's how God discloses himself. It's the self-disclosure of God. So when we talk about the Word of God, we oftentimes will use it to sort of be synonymous with the Bible too, right? That this is the Word of God. But that ultimately Jesus Christ is this ultimate disclosure of who God is. It's the ultimate Word, right? That is what's happening. And that Word became flesh. So, why flesh? Well, flesh has kind of almost a technical significance here of being like flesh and bones and blood, and there's no sense here where you can run away from this and say that he just sort of appeared to be human, right? No, he sweat, he bled, he went to the bathroom. This is a full human identity is what the flesh forces us to see. And this would have been crazy town to Greeks who would have thought this was nuts, because the purpose of life is to escape the body. The purpose of life is to rejoin the demiurge, to get rid of this prison. Whenever you hear someone talk about the body as a prison, that's not Christianity. That's actually Platonism. That's Greek philosophy. Christians will say that sometimes. They'll say, "My body's a prison I got to escape from," but that's not a Christian idea. It's sort of a baptized in or sort of brought in Greek idea, Western idea. You'll hear this all the time from people. Because the whole idea is that the general resurrection is a return to your body, your glorified new body. You want body, because your body is how you experience the world. Your body is good. Your body was created good. The physical world is not evil in and of itself. It's corrupted and needs to be redeemed and resurrected. It doesn't need to be escaped from. We don't need to fly away from it. We want to be here in a perfect world, in a remade world as it was always meant to be. So again, there's this embracing of the flesh, and again, there's also, of course, crazy to the Jews, right? And that's why we read last week in the Gospel, they're picking up stones to throw at them a bunch of times. In John's Gospel, we work our way through. Remember, that reading was from John's Gospel last week. He's going to constantly keep hammering on this, that I'm God. And they go, all right, and they start picking up thrones to kill him. It happens over and over and over again. And so the ridiculousness when people look at the Bible and say, well, Jesus never said he was God, the Jews sure thought he was. And that's why they're trying to kill him constantly in those sections. Not all the Jews, obviously. And I remember I only use that term because John uses it here. We don't want to, that isn't a pejorative term in any sense. It's just a way of describing the people who don't follow the way at that point. But anyway, he becomes the flesh. So, what else can we say about that? There's a sense here too that the flesh is very vulnerable, right? And when you think of sort of like what's some of the most vulnerable parts of your body, so the flesh kind of it gets cut, it goes away, it falls off. There's all sorts of things that can happen to it. It's the most corruptible part of the body too, if you think about it. In a word, it's also the most impermanent. We know this now. Like, this is something that, if you'd said, we know that the skin cells are constantly being replaced, right? They say every 7 years it's a whole new you, they say. That doesn't include brain cells, as I understand it. No, the brain cells don't get all changed out. But everything else is kind of like always kind of going away. Well, so the sense here is that you have this juxtaposition. You have these two things put together. you have the eternal Logos, right? Remember, verse 1 tells us, what does verse 1 tell us? In the beginning was the Word. Remember, we said beginning wasn't just sort of the beginning of creation. That beginning in the Greek has a sense of even before that. He's the source of creation, not just there hanging out, waving as God does stuff. He's the source of creation. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And so that Word, that eternal Logos, is made flesh. And that is an incredibly bold thing to write down, and would have made everybody crazy.
Even now.
Right, even now, yeah. If you start talking about the fact that, you start to tell people Jesus is God, they go, no, that can't be. Well, that would have been the exact same reaction that people would have had to that word now. I mean, exactly the same. They would use different terminology. They actually would use better terminology than we would use, much more. But in any event, they would have said, no, that's impossible. And they would have brought a perspective to this over and above the evidence. And that's the thing that's tragic about, earlier in the prologue, when it talks about that they didn't recognize him. The tragedy is that he does everything to show that he's God, raising the dead, healing people, doing all the things to show who he is, that he's the prophet, or that he is the Messiah Isaiah has been preparing them for, and that he's not just that, he's doing the things only God can do. And they go, nah, next. No, thank you. That's the horrible tragedy. That of verses 10 and 11, right?
I wonder if they were using that word, sarcos, if he was using that because it was so easy for Greeks to intellectualize the idea of God instead of get down to the real of what human is.
There's a huge difference between the Greek concept of God as being, a million miles away, being the formula, and the Jewish understanding of God as being much more, or the Jewish understanding of religion as being a much more visceral kind of down-to-earth thing, right? Yeah. No, that's definitely a big case. But even to that, the idea that God would come down into that filth,
Exactly.
and that's going to even blow a Jew's mind. That's too far. No, I can't accept that. Right. Well, I mean, that's ultimately always going to be the dividing line, right? There's just no space in here to say that this guy he's talking about is just some guy, right? That's simply not the claim John is making. All right, so and somehow the Logos doesn't stop being the Logos when this happens, right? He doesn't say the Logos stopped being the Logos and then became flesh. He says the Logos became flesh. Is that term, and this is the seventh use of that term, that egonento. Remember that Genesis language, right? That we see over and over and over again in this. This idea of the new creation happening, right? I mean, that's why John starts his book like he does. He wants you to be feeling the new Genesis happening already. Because if you were to stop and say, what is the Jesus Christ event mean? What does it mean that man rose from the grave? It means that the new creation is happening. And so John just starts his whole thing off with just new Genesis. This is a new Genesis that's happening. And part of that is man happening, right? Remember, this isn't a creation of the Word. Because remember, he's just spent, verse after verse telling us the Word was not created, right? The Word is the source of creation, so it can't be a creation, right? It can't be a created thing. But that Word became flesh, it dove into the creation itself, right? That's the distinction that Christianity spent such a long time making. And that is the distinction, as again, I'm trying to talk us through our formularies, through our Nicene Creed, through the Chalcedonian definition. Where did all that come from? And it came from looking at this and working our way through it grammatically and finding the only answers within it. One of the nice things about Greek is it's not ambiguous as English is. English is very ambiguous. Greek is not. It's very precise. All right. You can't get in here too some of the ideas like, this is why is this a key? I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. Like, why is this key? This isn't just sort of a mixture of God and humanity. It isn't, sort of God pretending to be a human. It's none of those things. I mean, I'm going to keep harping on this because poll after poll of American Christians will tell you that Jesus Christ was a creature, that the Son of God was created, which is, John spent all this time telling us that's not the case, because it blows up the whole Bible. That's how serious that is. I mean, that's why when we talk about being Trinitarian Christians, and that's just a no-go without that. When we talk about the nature of Christ as being fully divine, fully human, and that is just has to be, it's because if we don't have that, we then have to deny everything that we find from the gospel. All right. Sometimes this idea of the Logos becoming flesh is called the divine paradox. It is difficult to wrap our heads around. It should be. But also, in the context of John, when we think about this idea of taking on this flesh, we should also think about the idea that he's taking on a humanity that is in rebellion against God. So it's not as if he's just sort of like magically better than everyone else, right? That's not the case here. He's embracing a human nature that is in opposition to God. It's sort of like thinking about like putting on a uniform of the people who hate you, to be with them and to be around them. I mean, he's the light that's come into the world, but the world is complete darkness. One could ponder it forever. He takes on this state of Adam, right? And this is humiliation, as Paul puts it. This is a humiliating thing to do, but that's okay. It's okay to be humiliated. And there's a point Paul makes over and over and over again, because as seriously as we take sort of pride in our culture, and you got to have self-confidence and self-pride and all that. That's very much kind of a Roman idea too, right? So when he says people are going to make fun of you, people are going to try to kill you, people are going to take your things away, people are going to hurt you, you're going to have you should go out and make and be embarrassed, and that's okay. None of that matters. You can be humiliated by the world because our example is God humiliating himself to save us. So we have to humiliate ourselves to save someone else. And that's not the end of the world. It's going to be okay. It really is going to be all right. And we kind of, there's a certain part of us that knows that, but that doesn't make that any easier. Because we don't want to be humiliated by people. Everything about our culture, everything about our, how we are tells us that's not a good thing. That's the worst thing that can happen to us. But if it's in service to the salvation of the world, then I think of the dumb, humiliating things I did when I was in naval boot camp. Stupid things that were designed to sort of break me down and turn me into something else that could be useful, right? There's a certain sense in which, I don't know that I would wish that on like my children or someone else, but it did change me and make me, in some ways, better for the task that I had. It's an interesting concept to think about. I won't even go into any of those things, but that's the kind of vision we have here.
That's a scary sound.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you were talking to Paul. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. We may say I'm not ashamed of the gospel.
Right.
However, how do we portray that and put that out that you're not ashamed?
Right.
You're not talking Jesus every moment. You're not, thinking, but that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, we should be thinking about. It definitely is a case in which Paul talking to Timothy tonight in our reading, where he says, "I'm not ashamed of this." I mean, at this point, he's penniless, in prison, chained up, and I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I mean, there's a point where he asks Timothy to bring him his coat because he doesn't have a coat. Right? Make sure when you swoop back through here, you can give me my coat so I have, and then bring paper and pen because I'm going to be writing. Yeah, he is. And you can't break him. You're just gonna have to kill him. And that's eventually what they do. But what does it do? Does it break him? I mean, now we read St. Paul's letter tonight. How often do people read anything by Tiberius Caesar? How often do people read anything by all the men who thought they were powerful that killed Paul? They don't. Nobody does. I mean, except for nerds and weirdos. It's okay. But this is a thing that changed the world and continues to change the world in hearts. So, yeah, so you got to take the long view on this, and that's hard. That's very hard. But back to the long view, back to the people who were with him. We can't skip this word here. Eskenosin, he pitched his tent is literally what this means. But we say he dwelled among them, right? And so, packed into this idea is something that Jesus will even talk about himself being. If we think of what was the purpose of the great tent, the tabernacle, it was to hold within it, like tonight, the cloud of God that was inside of it, the glory of God, right? And so, what John's already hinting at is that there's a new tabernacle, there's a new temple, and that's Christ. That body, that flesh, contains within it God, right? And so he uses this word for the tent, or as the King James put it, will put it, like for instance last week in Hebrews 9, the tabernacle, right? He'll even just use that rather than tent, but they're pretty interchangeable terms. But just in case you missed it, tabernacle, friends, and that's why Jesus will say, "You tear down this temple in 3 days, and I'll build it. I'll build it back." Or tear down this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. And they go, "What are you talking about? It took us years to build this temple." So he's talking about himself. He's the temple, right? And then what happens after that, of course, is that all Christians become temples, right? On Pentecost, when the Spirit is inside of us, as Paul's talking about tonight in 2 Timothy, that the Spirit is in me and the Spirit is in you. They all become temples too. So you don't need the tent anymore. Right? You are the tent. It's fascinating, but that's what he's getting at. He's getting at these things all through there. But English just goes with dwell. Absolutely, that's a perfectly reasonable translation of that, the ESV. But that's sitting inside that Greek word. And then dwell with us, dwell among us. Yeah. All right. So next, we saw, right? And we saw who. Something important there is that this denotes a real seeing. This isn't like a spiritual seeing, right? Like we really wanted this to be true. It's an act. They saw a real physical object. But then the next great question is, who is the we? Right? And that's really easy to just run by that, right? Who's the we, right? Who we saw him. And so John, of course, is talking about the physical, real eyewitnesses who saw this God, this Logos made flesh, right? This Logos who became flesh. But even over and above that, too, you have the sense that there's also the we in ancient literature, a sort of authoritative testimony. So it's the same we. Jump ahead to 24, which is pretty much the end of the book. Page 1006 in those Bibles, 1006. And you have this sense here where he says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." So it's connected to that we as well. So it's John, but John also speaking for the authoritative witness of the church at this period, right? That we are the living witnesses of this happening, of this event, of this person. One of the blessings is that John survives a long time, and John is able to. So for instance, John dies most likely in the 90s.
Is he the last one?
Yes, he's the last, very much so. He's the only one who isn't murdered. He dies in exile in Patmos. But so for instance, you have people like Polycarp in the 2nd century who were taught by him, who knew knew John. So you have this sort of reaching out into here. So when we start talking about, we have documents, lots of documents from the 2nd century. We start thinking about that those are people who are within a generation of all this happening. John kind of has a long reach into that 2nd century, in a really interesting way. But yeah, the authoritative testimony to all that's happened here. This isn't just hearsay. This is eyewitness testimony to the events. One last thought on flesh before we just roll right by is remember to think of that flesh also has a sacrificial nature to it as well. Whenever we think of something of fleshliness as well, we think of something being sacrificed. So there's a foreshadowing in that as well that we'll pick up again in John 6 when we start talking about eating flesh and freaking people out, right? It's that same sarx, that same term will show up again. But anyway, we'll get there. We got to spend so much time on the prologue because the rest of the book doesn't make any sense without it. So, but anyway, let's keep going. His glory, so the Tain Doxon Atu, so the glory is what that literally would say, but his glory, right? So when we think of the glory of God, which is what we're talking about here, we think of, in the Old Testament, what's one of the big events that shows the glory of God? What's the biggest event in the Old Testament that shows the glory of God? It's a great question to think about. Right?
With Moses?
I would say yes. Where what would you think would be the greatest showing of the glory of God?
Well, when he, it could be up on the mountain, but it also could be when he actually had to hide himself, have him turn around.
Well, that's right. That's what he says. You're almost 2 steps ahead of me here, but you're absolutely right. That's where Moses says, "I want to see your glory." Right? He says, "If you see my glory, I'll kill you."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So he protects him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
If we think about sort of the great moment in which Yahweh pits himself against the great power of the age, where does that happen? Happens in the plagues, right?
Oh, the beginning of when they were-
So it happens in the plagues. It's a conflict. I mean, we think, why these weird plagues? What's this all about? I mean, it's a conflict between this great state of Egypt, right? Not really a state, but this great country of Egypt, this great culture, and its gods. And so all of the plagues match up with sort of the gods of Egypt and the powers that they supposedly have. And so it's literally the God, it's literally the I am, the Yahweh, showing that he has power of all those things. And there's those moments when the magicians are like, I don't know, we can't do this. This is beyond us. And it's a showing of the glory of God that can't be that there's nothing to contend against it, right? That's why that happens. It isn't as if God can't just smush Pharaoh like a bug and pull the people out, right? That could happen very easily. It's about a public viewing of the glory of God, showing all this happening. And there are lots of fascinating things to think about in there, right? Because this is the moments where Pharaoh's like, well, maybe I will let the people go, and then God hardens his heart, right? Because it's not done yet. There's more to show. More to show. Right? And that'll get you thinking for a while. Right? There's all sorts going on there. And Paul will talk about that too. But we can talk about that more in a sense. But
the Red Sea was probably glory too.
Of course it is. Right. And everyone loves to talk about the Red Sea. Like tonight, one of the great things about reading those really long Psalms, which modern lectionaries hate those really long Psalms, so they skip them because they're long, right?
Yeah,
and so people, but they're great because they're like this. You're basically reciting the history,
Yes.
and for the Jewish people this is really important, but that's our history too.
Yeah.
So it's an idea of sort of forcing yourself to say it out loud and go through it over and over again, so you don't make the same mistakes for one thing, but also to recognize that that's us. But yeah, I mean, you get that sense of we always think of them all being saved, but there's a second part of that where the water comes back and destroys the armies of Pharaoh, and that's a showcasing of God's glory. We can't miss out on this that saving people is showcasing God's glory, but also the destruction of evil is a showcasing of God's glory.
And that happens a lot in there.
It happens a lot in there, right? And that'll also be, and why do we have this? Why does God keep showing us this over and over and over and over again? Because it's a warning for the end.
Mm-hmm.
That at the end of time, certainly God's glory will be shown in the people he saves, that his mercy and love. But his justice will just as much showcase his glory. And we can't, so much of modern American Christianity does not want to think about that second part. Don't make me think about that. I don't want to think about that. But you can't get a true picture of the real God without it. So it's just something else. It's something else we've made up.
They don't understand what we're being saved from.
Right. I mean, at that point, if you're not being saved from anything, then what does it all matter? It's mostly just good advice and makes us feel better about ourselves, as opposed to being actual salvation from destruction. In the most, from getting what we deserve is ultimately what it means. And that's hard to tell people. People don't like to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. But that's why that's what not by missing out on all that Old Testament, by not looking at what's happening there, we miss out on what is basically a theater for us of God operating in the world and showing us what awaits us if we're not his. But something about that glory, something about God's Old Testament glory was always incomplete, though. I mean, we can talk about him defeating Egypt, absolutely. But he didn't defeat the whole world. Right? There are lots of evil going on all over the place, too. Even Egypt still survives, right? Egypt isn't crushed. Some of that is they could always tell a story, right? There's a sense in which, they kept telling that story, right? But there's a great verse in Isaiah. It's the end of the book, in 690, it's page 698, that talks about the glory of God. So it's Isaiah 66:18 on page 698. Again, another book. The end of the book. It's looking forward to the day that the glory of God would be exalted. So, for I know their works and their thoughts, and the time is coming to gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory. So this is a key understanding. This is the end of Isaiah. Isaiah is oftentimes called, the fifth gospel, because there's so much in it about the Messiah, so much in it about the new creation, so much in it about the end. You look at verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord. This is just, the point that, John's making with all this talk about glory is that this is all this happening. This is this coming true in Christ. That all in the Old Testament, the glory of God is always mercifully held back. Because remember, the glory, as I said, is not just salvation, it's judgment. So there's a sense in which it's held back, right, to give time. And so we see that glory has come in Christ. Now, of course, we don't want to jump the gun here. When is that glory fully realized? It's realized in the second coming of Christ. Again, a merciful time in which we're allowed to gather more people in the kingdom of God and grow in holiness. Right? It's a merciful time. Even if we're destroyed, it's a merciful time, even with how terrible people are to themselves and to each other. But God allowing it all to go on. A great example of this in the 20th century, of course, is people talk about it as a Holocaust. Like, why would God let that continue? Why didn't he just shut it down? Human project is over. We get a picture of that this evening in Numbers. We were reading about Moses, and as the Psalm says, he stands before the gap and pleads with God for his people. He mediates between the Father and his people. And God says, he says this a bunch of times. This is in Exodus and in Numbers. After the calf, he says this in Exodus. But Moses, this is it. I'm killing all the people. We're starting over with you. You're the new Abraham. Let's do this. And God knows he's not going to do that. But Moses goes in and goes, "Oh, please, God, don't do this. Take me, not them." And of course, what is that supposed to What is that preparing us for? Why is that there? It's to prepare us for that full revelation of that in Christ. And that's ultimately what Christ does, of course. He stands in the gap. He's the one who takes it all. Moses can't really do that, right? That's why God still has to punish the people, right? But Jesus can. Jesus can take it.
There were so many of them were so much like Jesus. That, like you said, a foreshadowing of Jesus.
Right. I mean, why are those people there? They're types that are meant to see. They're supposed to, that all come to fruition in the perfect human, right? Which makes sense, right? The perfect man, Christ, whose glory and His glory. So where did this glory come from? We get this awesome term, monogenos, mono, right? Which means monorail, one, right? So one generated, one begotten is what we come down with. So when we say in the Creed, the only begotten Son of God, monogenos, you can't get more than one mono. It's one. He's it, right? Which means that He's of a different nature than the children of God, right? Children, in the last verse, right? Multiples. There's only one Son of God. So when heretics say things like, Jesus is one of the created things, that doesn't make any sense because He's fully unique, because He's one, right? He can't be just another part of creation. He can't be as Arius, the great 4th century heretic who caused the Council of Nicaea to happen, said that He was the first of creatures. Well, no, He can't be. He can't be. He's of a different order than the children we just talked about, right? That's really important, super important. This could be translated in a few ways. Some modern translators will call Him the unique Son. That kind of pulls that out. From the Father. Oftentimes, the SSA is begotten from the Father, but they'll go ahead and say, because the reason the whole begotten thing is that a thing can only, it's an old idea that a thing can only beget itself. So like a human can only beget human, a animal can only beget a rabbit, that kind of idea. So it was sort of a way of saying that it's a unique sense of that. In this, that unique Son. The ESV has a translation they use here. They say, as of the only Son from the Father. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. So they kind of go with only Son, kind of as the idea there. But it's okay. That's fine. But you kind of really got to, in the Greek, that just kind of screams out. As I said, that genos is that creation kind of idea, or the same manifestation idea. So He's the mono begotten one, which is fascinating. Again, begotten, not made. That's that distinction we make in the Creed.
Created and not created. Begotten, not created.
Right. Begotten, not made is a really key distinction, which is just a way of delineating between this and those children we just talked about, right? And that makes perfect sense within this sequence, and it's the most fruitful way. Because if you look at as we're standing here, look at verse 13, verse 12. But to all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born out of blood, so that they are the children of God. And so this, though, is not that, right? This is not one of the made children of God. This is the begotten Son, that eternal Logos, right? The argument is so tight. You just gotta carry it with you through the verses. And that's just one verse earlier. It seems like it's 1,000 miles away. All right? It seems like, oh my God, 13. Oh, geez. I don't know, 14. Let me give you a break. Yeah, no, but it's the same. Remember, all the punctuation, the verses, that's all later additions, right? This was all would have just been, the original manuscript would have just been capital letters, no spaces, just all the way through. No, that's how you would have gotten it. And you would have sound out the words. And that's how you that's how if you look, you can see the ancient manuscripts. They're available online. You can see them like, oh man. Even if you know Greek, it's like, oh no. no, I'm having trouble. Because it's hard to read like that. But remember, paper is really expensive. You don't have the space and the time, right? Like, for instance, there's an old holdover on this. A little brief digression. The term paragraph, you ever thought about that? Why do we call it paragraph? Para means next to. The graph is writing. It used to be that it wasn't an indentation. You would just make a little note on the side, next on the side of the writing. That's a paragraph, and mark the new paragraph. Because paper is so expensive, you can't just be making indentations and spaces.
Question.
Please.
Not sure if this is a silly one or not.
No, there are no silly questions.
No questions.
When you look at the comparison between how we're doing now, Greek versus English,
Sure.
how does it line up when you look at Hebrew versus Greek, when you put those two translations side by side?
So the good news is, all the New Testament is in Greek. First, it's his first language. Old Testament, of course, originally, most of the Old Testament is all in Hebrew. Some parts of it are in Greek, some parts of it are tiny parts, but most of it's all in Hebrew. So then what you can do is you can actually look at the 2nd century BC, the Septuagint, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew. And that's the Bible that is most quoted by the New Testament writers because they're writing in Greek. So they're going to quote from the Septuagint in Greek already. It just makes things easier. But again, so the nice thing is when we look at the Greek here, you're looking at, what did John actually literally write down? This is it, right? These are the words he actually used. So that's what's neat about this. This is not. That's why. So a translation is always going to be trying to an approximation of all of that, right? And so Hebrew is a little. There are people who argue that it's easier to translate from Hebrew to English or Greek to English. Hebrews they have different ways in which the grammar is much harder in Greek to translate in because it doesn't have a set structure. Like English, we have subject, verb, object is pretty much always the way. In Hebrew, it's verb, subject, object. But it's pretty constant like that. It's pretty rare. It's pretty.
Aramaic is another ballgame.
Well, and Aramaic's pretty close. I mean, if you can read Hebrew, you can fight through Aramaic pretty easily. I mean, there are differences. There absolutely are, and there's this whole thing. But if you kind of know what you're doing, I mean, Aramaic is a derivative of Hebrew. It's kind of like a colloquial Hebrew's way of thinking about it, right? And so but remember, Greek is the international language of the time of Christ. So the idea that people wouldn't have been speaking Greek around there is not the case. Greek was the language of the Roman Empire at this point. And so it had been spread by Alexander the Great's empire, and then Rome also had used it as well. So it would have been kind of the international language. So that's why this is written in Greek, because this is going to be spread throughout the whole world. So if you wanted to communicate with people, you couldn't write it in Aramaic. You couldn't write it in Hebrew. You needed to write it in the international language. And so you wrote it in Koine Greek. Koine Greek means sort of common Greek. We have the Book of Common Prayer. Common Greek is what this is. This is nothing like, especially John's Greek, which is beautiful but very workmanly. He's a fisherman, not a poet. But he comes through in beautiful ways. But yeah, so that's a long answer to your question. But yes, this would have been originally all in Greek. And the Hebrew to English too is, it's some, one of the reasons you study, I think all priests should study the languages and ministers should study the languages is because there are subtleties and differences that you just got to know, and you got to go in and be able to tell the difference in. And when someone asks a question, to be able to kind of take that out and really know, or at least know where to go to find out, right? And there's just lots of great information that can be found within the actual text itself. That especially with the ESV, they're trying to write this at a 7th grade level, right? This is what the ESV is written in. NIV is like a 5th grade level. So they're trying to make it simultaneously contain all of the mysteries of God and be able to be read by a 7th grader. That's hard. That's really hard, right? That's a lot to ask of somebody. So when they look at something like that, they're like, we're just going to go with something a little bit, or this tempting 12. Let's go with that because that's a perfectly good, reasonable, and you could get that from there, and that is exactly what it's talking about, right? But there's just John has depth in here too that a Greek reader would go, especially a Greek reader is familiar with the Septuagint, the Greek. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, right? So just tons of stuff in here that's really important. to get a sense of what's actually happening in it. And that's why I'm spending so much time with this language and doing this.
It's kind of interesting because, I mean, even in this community here, Greeks learn Greek.
Sure.
And then they spend 3 hours in class in services on Sunday.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Jews learn Hebrew.
Right.
And then they spend 3 hours, at least not in the Reform, but
Sure, I know what you
in
mean.
the
I know what you
conservative
mean,
or the Orthodox, 3 hours in
Yeah.
temple. And their services are done
In those languages.
Yeah.
Sure.
So children who are American Greeks know how to speak
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Greek at a young age.
Oh yeah.
And then their religious instruction is in Greek. Their service is in Greek.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty impressive. And the same for the Jews.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it maintains that heritage, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, like for instance, I really like at the Holy Trinity School, Lindisfarne Hall. Their kids study Greek, and they're going to do Hebrew too eventually. Why would you do that? Well, because you want people to be, the idea is if you're going to design an educational system, why not choose? You used to do Latin, you used to learn Greek. Yeah, that's something that used to be part. Sure.
All these founding
Sure they
fathers,
did.
they all spoke these languages. They were privately tutored, maybe, but they never learned.
But that's something you learn.
Classical education.
Right, and exactly, that was part of the classical education, right? So why, if we were designing a curriculum for students, why wouldn't we teach them to learn how to read Greek, be able to read the Word of God in its original language?
As I told I don't know if you know, I'm a baptized member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Sure.
And when it did come to Bermuda, where I'm from in the early 70s, but they brought the church there in English because we had to speak English.
Right.
But when we, as a teenager, I'm thinking back when we had Bible study and such, we were learning Amharic, and because of that being, their language.
The original language,
Right.
yeah.
So the church there, I could pray in a way we understood. Now here, this is one of the reasons I kind of ended up here,
Sure.
is because when I looked around for Ethiopian Orthodox churches here, none of them had a service in English.
Sure.
And so again, I was
That's really
looking
hard.
for just the ancient form of worship.
Sure.
And then Anglican. And I remember my dad, years back saying we have a good relationship with the Anglican Church.
Sure, absolutely.
And so forth. And but they come here and understand.
Right, it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
No, I think that is the case. I think there's much. I'm an Anglican for a lot of reasons, but one, I think we were right in the 16th century that it was important for people to be able to understand the services they were involved in.
Right.
I'm 100% there, be able to read the Bible in their own language. But that is a gift.
Yeah. People said to me, well, you can still go to the Orthodox service and at least, you're probably
Right.
but it's still something to knowing what's being said. And,
Right. It's
and,
absolutely. 100%.
And so, yeah.
And it's kind of my job too within our community to be able to know this and be able to talk us through it and be able to work with us. Right now you have access to this because we're part of a faith community, right? Obviously I wish more people would be open themselves up to this because it changes the way you think about the Bible in a big way. But yeah, no, until we can, even if we did have every single person who know Greek, it's still, I have to spend a lot of time too studying this and looking over interpretations and working through this to make sure I'm giving the best I can. It's not, and not every, nobody, as we talked about sort of in our first class, I was making a joke about you, Penny, forcing you to try to interpret this right now after you've been working all day is a horrible thing for me to try to make you do. Which is what so many Bible studies I've been to are like, so Penny, what do you think this means? Like, that's entirely unfair to do. Yeah, right, and you haven't been looking at it. I've spent hours looking at this thing trying to figure out what and that's just completely unfair, and you're not going to come up with anything. I know. I was in those Bible studies. I remember being in those and, like, I don't know, what do you think? That's terrible. No, that's horrible. Why would you do that? You don't do that anything else. Like, you look at, do you know how to change the oil? I don't know. Let's just mess around with it and see what happens. You're not going to change a lot of oil. Yeah, just hope it happens. Like, you might get the right answer, but you probably won't. You probably won't.
I might do that commercial where the kid says, is this a love wrench? I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, exactly right. It's not going to turn out well. So, let me finish up because I'm almost at the hour. We talked about that one is, but that one's a little fast, but it's an hour slow, but it's fast. That makes sense. But anyway, so, and of course, we have to understand too that he's related from the Father, right? That's incredibly clear. So we get the sense of at the beginning that, in verse 1, we said the Word was God, the Word was with God, right? So the Word is there, and we get to see here the mission of the Son, that the Father sends him into this world. The Son sends the Logos in flesh into the world. That's the mission. And that's, as I say, when I talk about 14:1 being really related to one another, you get that sense that, where does this Logos come from? We already know, because he told us in verse 1, the Logos was God and with God, right? Which is why we have to say stuff like one God in three persons. It's the only way to make sense of this, of the words that are before us. Okay, from the Father, and then you have this idea of his sort of full Pleres, Christos, Kai, Aletheus, which is full of grace and truth, right? Full of grace and truth. And so this is a great allusion to, for instance, I won't make you turn there, but it's an idea that you get in Exodus over and over again. We heard it tonight when Moses was talking, but it's first said in 34:6, where God tells him who he is, and he says, "I'm full of grace and truth." Like that's the thing that sort of one of the things that defines who God is, right? It's a term that shows the goodness which is God's glory, and that his grace and truth. He is grace and truth.
That's a big subject, right?
Yeah, no, it's a huge idea. This idea of grace and truth, and so it's kind of a marker of God, and it also shows that when he says it over and over and over again in the Old Testament, it's that the covenantal faithfulness that people will always work through. That his grace and his and truth means that he's merciful, gives to the undeserving. Because remember, grace is not what you deserve, right? Gives to what you don't deserve, and he always keeps his promises. That's really good news. You want a God who is incredibly merciful and keeps his promises. I mean, that's everything. That's everything in that sense, and that's what Christ is full of. He's full of not giving us what we deserve, and full of the truth. And that's the sense of this, right? And that the Son, sending the Son, is the ultimate expression of this, right? The thing that makes God merciful and always keeping his promises is the sending of the Son. That the Son has come to be full of grace, to give us salvation when we don't deserve it, and to keep the promises that he made all the way back to Abraham. That's how it happens, is through this, through the Logos pitching his tent among us in humanity's form. This is the evidence that God is Father to the children of men, the children of God. This is that evidence. That's what verse 14 is about at the end of the day. This is how God keeps his promises. And we don't deserve that, obviously. We don't deserve God becoming a human being to save us from ourselves. That's what grace is. And the truth of it is him keeping his promises. Which is bad news for evil, really good news for the children of God. Those children of God he mentioned in verse 13, right? See, again, it seems 1,000 miles ago, but in verse 12 and 13, talking about the children of God.
And this is only for the children of God, right?
Well, I mean, it definitely, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's better for evil to be punished than not. It's better for the evil to be punished than not to be punished. So there's a sense in which we can never forget that stopping evil from doing evil is a good thing in and of itself, right? So there's that part of it too. But the children of God in all of this are obviously undeservedly blessed in a way that's impossible to kind of wrap our heads around. that God would come in flesh to save them.
And those same children of God, is that the same as the chosen of God?
Well, I mean, what does it say about the children of God? Look at verse 12. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. So there's a sense here in which to be born, to be created, what you're going to find over and over and over again, that it's a response to a call that draws people to Jesus, right? When you think of him calling the 12, right, to himself, we think of, over and over again in the book, that's the case, right? So yeah, of course it's a response to a call, but I mean, what John is trying to get us to look at, 30,000 feet up, from the beginning of the world, something Paul alludes to a lot, right? He alluded to that tonight where he said that the people of God were the people from the beginning, right? I mean, that's what Paul talks about that. From the 30,000 feet up, that the whole salvation project, the whole end of the world and the creation of the new is being accomplished by God, right? That's something that should fill us with comfort. That this isn't sort of a project we got to figure out and work through. It shouldn't make us complacent, but it should fill us with comfort. That.
But then there's what's that? Fear and trembling. Work out our salvation with fear and trembling.
Boy,
The
that's.
fear is the awesomeness. I mean,
And when we say salvation, we remember Paul uses. This is another long discussion, but let me give you a little footnote on that. When Paul uses salvation, he can mean that to mean the whole process of salvation, right? So we can talk about you have been saved, you are being saved, and you will be saved. Because he's talking about, he can use salvation to mean the entire process of regeneration, justification, sanctification. So within your sanctification right now, you're the Holy Spirit making you holy, and you participating in that through prayer and fasting, Bible study, almsgiving, all those things. Yeah, you should be working that out with some fear and trembling, all day long. But when we start thinking about, am I the one doing it? Which you get here is we're building up towards the cross, and which is the ultimate humiliation of God, which is the ultimate fleshly sacrifice of God, right? And that just is just not our only participation in that is getting the nails in the wood and the hammer. That's our participation in that, right? Which is why I took, like, for instance, on this Sunday, when we read out Matthew's Passion, what do we say? Crucify him, crucify him. And that's an ancient practice of doing that, because it's to remember that he hangs on the cross for us, because of us. Which is something, right? So yeah, some fear and trembling is probably a good idea. But there's also joy, comfort, peace that comes from knowing that it all got done there. It is finished. Not, well, I sure hope Kathy gets to finish this for me. Otherwise, we're in real trouble. That would be a different story. But anyway, I went over it then, I'm sorry. With one verse, I know, but it's such a big verse. Like, what would you cut out on that verse is just huge, right? And what would you cut out of that verse? I mean, there's even more we could have talked about, I swear. We just had to run through Grace and Truth, I'm afraid. But as long as you have that sense of what that's him keeping his promise that we don't deserve through Christ, you get a sense of what's going to keep coming at us throughout this book. How magnificent it is.
How far does the prologue go?
Verse 18.
Okay.
1 through 18 is traditionally what we kind of call the prologue. You also hear it sometimes read as the last gospel. It's also the gospel of Christmas morning. Is John 1, traditionally. But anyway, and you can kind of see why. If you want an explanation of who Jesus is and why it matters, John 1 through 18, right? That's why. So, why do we celebrate Christmas? Here you go.